We are told that history is written by the victors, but more often it is written by those who hold the pen, who control the narrative, who decide which names are etched into the stone of legacy and which are allowed to dissolve into the silent dust of the archives. For decades, the story of modern medicine had a miraculous, almost divine beginning. It was a story of a spontaneous gift to humanity. A line of human cells discovered in 1951 that possessed a power previously thought impossible. They were immortal. They never died. They replicated endlessly in petri dishes, a tireless biological engine that would power the greatest medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. From Johns Salk's polio vaccine to the mapping of the human genome, from cancer research to AIDS treatments, their contribution is immeasurable. Science gave these miraculous cells a name, a sterile four-letter designation that appeared in tens of thousands of scientific papers, HeLa. We were told they came from a woman named Helen Lane, or perhaps Helen Larson, an anonymous donor, a footnote. But that was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction to obscure a profound injustice. History preferred to forget her real name. Her name was Henrietta Lacks. Our story begins not in a gleaming laboratory, but in the segregated colored ward of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, 1951. Henrietta Lacks, a 31-year-old black mother of 5, a vibrant former tobacco farmer from Virginia with a radiant smile and a love for dancing, walked into the hospital with a secret torment. A knot in her womb that was bleeding, causing her pain. The doctors diagnosed it as a viciously aggressive cervical cancer. In an era of stark medical paternalism and systemic racism, Henrietta placed her trust in the institution, one of the few that would treat black patients, albeit in separate, often inferior facilities. During her radium treatments, a surgeon followed standard procedure. He took a sample of her tumor for biopsy. But then, he did something else. Without her knowledge, without her consent, he sliced a second piece of tissue, not for her diagnosis, but for research. It was for Dr. George Gay, a researcher at Johns Hopkins who was consumed by a holy grail of biology, to grow the first immortal human cell line. For years, Gay's lab was a graveyard of failed attempts. Every human cell sample he cultured would thrive for a few days, a few weeks at most, and then wither and die. It was a fundamental rule of biology. But Henrietta's cells were different. They were brilliant. They were relentless. Placed in a nutrient broth by Gay's assistant, they did not die. Instead, they doubled, and doubled again every 24 hours. They grew with a ferocity the scientists had never witnessed. They grew with a ferocity the scientists had never witnessed. Gay knew he was looking at a miracle. He named the cell line HeLa, using the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last names, a common practice to maintain a thin veneer of anonymity. The timing was perfect. The world was terrified of polio, and Johns Salk was on the verge of developing a vaccine, but he needed a way to test it on a massive scale, on living human cells that could be grown consistently and endlessly. HeLa was the answer. Gay, in a fit of scientific evangelism, began shipping vials of HeLa cells to any researcher who asked for them. They were sent through the mail in simple tubes, a biological revolution delivered by the postman. A factory was established at the Tuskegee Institute, a place already infamous for its unethical syphilis study, to mass-produce HeLa cells for the polio trials. Soon they were everywhere. They were shot into space to see the effects of zero gravity. They were subjected to nuclear radiation to study its impact. They became the bedrock of a burgeoning multi-billion-dollar commercial industry in biological materials. All the while, the woman they came from was fading. As her cells began their immortal life in labs across the globe, Henrietta Lacks was dying a brutal, agonizing death from the cancer that spawned them. The radium treatments had burned her insides, and the tumors had spread throughout her body. She died on October 4, 1951, and was buried in an unmarked grave in a family plot in rural Virginia. She never knew that a part of her had been rendered immortal. Her family knew only that they had lost their beloved mother. Her name was Wichernuli Izuchebniki, her identity erased, her contribution stolen and rebranded as an anonymous gift. The conflict was not between a single hero and a single villain, but between the relentless, amoral ambition of scientific progress and the sacred, forgotten dignity of one human life. For more than 2 decades, the Lacks family lived in the shadow of a legacy they didn't know existed. They lived in poverty, often unable to afford the very medical care that their mother's sales had helped to revolutionize. This is the cruelest of ironies. Henrietta's children couldn't get basic health care while her biological material was generating immense wealth and saving countless lives in a world that didn't know their name. They remembered their mother, Loretta Pleasant, who later changed her name to Henrietta, as a warm, caring woman who cooked for the entire neighborhood. They grieved her loss, unaware that she was, in a biological sense, still alive in millions of laboratories across the planet. The story of HeLa cells was a triumph of science. For the Lacks family, it was about to become a story of profound trauma, a confrontation with the past they never knew had been stolen from them. The anomalous miracle was about to unravel. The moment of revelation came, as it so often does, with a phone call in the early 1970s. Scientists were facing a crisis. HeLa cells were so aggressive, so robust, that they were contaminating other cell cultures, ruining experiments worldwide. To solve this, they needed to map HeLa's genes. And to do that, they needed to go back to the source. They needed DNA from Henrietta's family to create a genetic map. A researcher tracked down and called Henrietta's husband, Day Lacks. The conversation, as recounted by the family, was a masterpiece of obfuscation. The scientist spoke of immortal cells, of a part of Henrietta that was still alive and helping science. For a family with little formal education and a deep-seated, historically justified distrust of white doctors, this was terrifyingly confusing. Did they mean their mother was literally, physically alive somewhere? Was this some kind of voodoo? They were asked to donate blood. The family, thinking it was a test to see if they carried the same cancer that killed Henrietta, agreed. They hoped it might finally bring them some help, some answers. Instead, it was a second violation. Once again, their bodies were being mined for data without true informed consent. The full, horrifying truth emerged in pieces. A daughter-in-law working in a lab recognized the name Lacks when a colleague mentioned the origin of HeLa cells. Then, in 1976, a journalist for Rolling Stone magazine, Michael Rogers, published an article that for the first time connected the famous HeLa cells to a woman named Henrietta Lacks. For her children, especially her daughter Deborah, the discovery was a cataclysm. Imagine the storm of emotions, immense pride that her mother, a poor black woman, had contributed something so monumental to the world. But that pride was swallowed by a tidal wave of anger and betrayal. Her mother's body had been desecrated. Her cells were taken like she was a lab rat, not a human being. They were being bought and sold, and her family hadn't seen a penny. They couldn't even afford a headstone for her unmarked grave. Deborah's journey became a desperate quest for identity, both her mother's and her own. She was haunted by questions. What did it mean that her mother's cells were alive? Could they feel pain? She devoured every scientific article she could find, struggling through the dense jargon, trying to understand the ghost that was her mother. The conflict intensified as this grieving, bewildered family tried to confront the antagonist, the powerful, impersonal, and often condescending medical establishment. When they called Johns Hopkins for answers, they were met with a wall of silence or legalistic deflections. They were told the cells were a gift. They were told the hospital made no money from them, a claim that was technically true for the hospital itself, but ignored the billions of dollars flowing through the wider biomedical industry that Hopkins had enabled. It was a battle of memory against erasure, of a family's love against an institution's cold indifference. When they called Johns Hopkins for answers, they were met with a wall of silence or legalistic deflections. They were told the sales were a gift. They were told the hospital made no money from them, a claim that was technically true for the hospital itself, but ignored the billions of dollars flowing through the wider biomedical industry that Hopkins had enabled. It was a battle of memory against erasure, of a family's love against an institution's cold indifference. The brilliance of Henrietta's cells was now forever overshadowed by the ethical nightmare of their origin. The scientific miracle had a human cost, and the bill, unpaid for decades, had finally come due. The family now knew the truth, but their fight to reclaim their mother's name and their own dignity had only just begun. A story, once unleashed, has a power of its own. The Lacks family's painful discovery was no longer a private grief. It was becoming a public reckoning. The final chapter of this story is not about scientific discovery, but about the fight to reclaim a stolen legacy. A fight fueled by the tenacity of Henrietta's family and amplified by a new generation of journalists determined to expose the truth. In the shadows of the scientific giants, a human story of injustice had been hiding, and it was finally clawing its way into the light. The key that unlocked the archives of the past was Rebecca Skloot, a science writer who spent a decade earning the trust of the Lacks family, particularly the fiercely protective and deeply wounded Deborah. Skloot's journey, documented in her landmark book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, transformed a historical footnote into an international conversation. It was no longer a story about cells. It was a story about ethics, race, class, and the soul of medical research. The publication of the book was a seismic event. It forced the world to see the woman behind the acronym. The injustice was no longer abstract. It had a face, a family, and a history of pain. The narrative shifted irrevocably. HeLa cells, once celebrated as a pure scientific marvel, were now a symbol of institutional racism and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The conflict moved out of the Lacks' living room and into the lecture halls, hospital boardrooms, and government committees of the world. The brilliance of her cells was finally attributed to her, not as an anonymous donor, but as Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose body contributed immeasurably to science and whose rights were immeasurably violated. Her name was being written back into the story from which it had been so cruelly erased. This act of recognition began a cascade of vindication. Johns Hopkins issued public apologies and created programs in her honor. Universities held symposiums on the ethical questions her case raised. Her hometown of Turner Station erected a monument. Her children, who had grown up in her shadow, were now invited to speak at global science conferences, finally given a voice in their mother's legacy. Yet, justice remains incomplete. The Lacks family has never been financially compensated for the multi-billion-dollar industry that her cells created. The legal arguments are complex. In 1951, there were no laws against taking a patient's cells without consent for research. The cells were legally considered abandoned property. While this legal reality is a bitter pill, the family has achieved a different, perhaps more profound form of justice. In 2013, after scientists sequenced the HeLa genome and published it without the family's permission, another shocking violation, a landmark agreement was reached with the National Institutes of Health. For the first time, the Lacks family was given a seat at the table. 2 family members now sit on the committee that reviews applications from researchers seeking to use Henrietta's genomic data. They have regained a measure of control, a sliver of the bodily autonomy that was stolen from Henrietta herself. Why is it so imperative that we know her name today? Because the ghost of Henrietta Lacks haunts every laboratory and every hospital in the modern world. Her story became the catalyst for a revolution in medical ethics. The entire framework of informed consent, the principle that patients have the right to know and approve what is done to their bodies, was built upon the ashes of her exploitation. Every time you sign a consent form at a hospital, you are feeling the impact of her legacy. Her story is a permanent, searing reminder that scientific progress cannot be divorced from human rights. It is a testament that behind every sample, every data point, and every breakthrough, there is a human being. The conflict endures, the struggle to balance the quest for knowledge with our fundamental duty to one another. Henrietta's cells gave her a form of biological immortality. But by fighting to tell her story, by refusing to let her name be forgotten, we grant her a second, more meaningful immortality. We ensure that history finally remembers not the specimen, but the woman. And in doing so, we restore not only her dignity, but a piece of our own humanity.